Welcome, everyone. We've got a few more joining us here real quick. For those who don't know me, I am Jamie Cope with the WVU Industrial Extension, and it's great to see everybody here and staying warm today as opposed to coming out and trying to do this in person. Really excited about what we've got going on today. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started, and most of you know this, but we're going to keep you muted through the presentation. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We want this to be as interactive, and we want this to be as much about what you want to get out of it as what we want to give to you. So please, any kind of questions, put them in the chat. Bathrooms are upstairs and to the left. Okay. A few quick things before we get started. We've got at the extension, we've got a supply chain webinar coming up next month. That's going to be 4 in-depth sessions to provide actionable insights, practical tools, and strategic frameworks to optimize your manufacturing operations. Coverage of critical topics include operations integration, strategic planning, cultivating supplier relationships, and future-proofing systems with technology. So if you're interested in learning more about supply chain, just scan that QR code. Adam Lowe, who has done, you may have seen some of his previous presentations with us. He does a fantastic job. So if you're interested, just scan that QR code and sign up for those webinars as well. One other thing I wanted to jump into real quick before we got started is I met some folks from it's a website, I guess you'd say, called All for American, excuse me. And they do basically they sell products that are made entirely in America. They're getting ready to start including food on the website. So it's a big promotional website. I'm not going to try to explain it. It's really cool. You should check it out. I'm going to encourage the folks who are with them to just put their contact information in the chat. And if you're looking for extra outlets for your stuff, please check them out and see if it's a good fit for you. All right, so I believe that's what we've got for now. We're going to pass this off to Cathy Crawford, who is the president of the HACCP Consulting Group. It's been great working with Cathy to get this together. She's a lot of fun. Don't let me down, Cathy. Be a lot of fun. Just so you know, this is an introductory webinar. We are planning some follow-up down the road. So if you're interested in getting a little bit more in depth, please reach out to me and you can reach out to Cathy too, but I think we're going to do some coordinated efforts from the industrial extension. So reach out to me and we'll get you on a list of folks that would like to learn more and maybe get into some HACCP planning or something like that. It looks like we just had Trey Yates join us, and so I'm gonna switch gears real quick. I'm gonna let Trey talk just a little bit about the Food and Farm Coalition, which some of you may be very familiar with them, and some of the things that they have coming down the pike. So Trey, if you want to go ahead and jump right in, that would be great.
Yeah. Can everybody hear me? I'm in a hotel room, so Wi-Fi is not the best. Anyway, I'm the value-added technical assistant provider for the Food and Farm Coalition. We're open to helping any value-added producer out there. It doesn't matter if you're doing dairy products, jams, jellies, salsa, anything you can think of. We'll figure out a way to help you. We got the resources that we can get you the help you need. This is a good step to get you into a HACCP training and then get you further down the line. We're like the TA that we provide, it's completely free. It costs nothing. We may just ask for you to fill out a survey. So then we got some stuff working to where maybe further down the line we can get some HACCP plans put together for people. More to come, but come talk to us first. Come talk to us first, and then we'll see what we can financially help you with.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Trey, for joining us. I know you've got a lot going on. So we will be putting some contact information for the Food and Farm Coalition in the email that goes out after this is over. And I guess I was supposed to warn everybody that we are recording and that this recording will be distributed to everybody too. So if you lose your connection or something happens. So again, thanks so much, Trey.
No problem.
Appreciate
Y'all have a
your
good
time.
training.
We'll catch up with you sometime soon, I'm sure.
See ya.
All right. So now we've got Cathy Crawford, the president of HACCP Consulting Group. And Cathy, I'm going to let you just take it away.
All right, thanks. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Really wasn't sure what kind of mixture of people we.
I'm not seeing you shared yet, Cathy.
It's unhappy. Let me try again. We'll try that way. Better?
Yeah, there we go.
Right. Only takes 2 tries. That's not too bad. Okay. Really wasn't sure what kind of mixture of people we'd get today, but this is just an overview of HACCP plans, who needs one, what are they, and maybe if you've never approached this territory in your business or with others, you know, what do you do next to learn more? So please just, you know, if you have a question along the way, feel free to ask or put it in the chat and we'll try and get to it, but it's not a complete HACCP class. We don't have that kind of time. It's just kind of an introduction. Okay, so we're going to talk about who needs a food safety plan, what are the parts of a HACCP or a food safety plan, and how to get rolling on that topic. So who needs a plan? Sadly, the answer is not simple. And I see, Natasha, you are laughing. Thanks, you understand. Sometimes HACCP is mandatory on a regulatory basis, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a local requirement. And sometimes it's a customer requirement. It depends on what you're making, who your target audience is, and why you might need a plan. If you have food in interstate commerce, meaning you're not just selling in the state of West Virginia, it's going across state lines, federal regulations may or may not apply depending on what you make and how much of it you make. In general, HACCP is mandatory for meat, poultry, seafood, and juice. But there are all kinds of exceptions to these rules. So anytime somebody approaches the idea that, hey, they need a HACCP plan, the first thing you want to do is understand why they need it, because that will impact sometimes the design, knowing the motivation as to what they're trying to comply with, either a customer requirement or a federal or state one. So just to make sure we're clear on a federal level, we need to know the difference between FSIS or USDA and the FDA. Hopefully this isn't incredibly simple to you, but I didn't know, you know, where we're starting in our conversation about food. FSIS is the Food Safety Inspection Service. They are a branch of the USDA, and they regulate meat, poultry, eggs out of the shell, and catfish. If there's 2% or more of that in a cooked product or 3% or more of those things in a raw product, they fall under USDA or FSIS jurisdiction. It can get very complicated, but imagine a cheese pizza is going to be an FDA product. A pepperoni pizza is going to be a USDA or FSIS product if there's enough pepperoni on it. So there are caveats to this, but that's the basics as to what regulation or what an entity has jurisdiction over different foods. Why does that matter? HACCP requirements are ultimately, they follow the same fundamental requirements, but there are little differences between the two agencies. You also might, sorry, before I go too fast here, you also might need a HACCP plan based on local regulations. In that case, it's typically the local or state health department that's asking for a HACCP plan. And it's usually because there's a higher risk to the process that's being undertaken. For example, sometimes sous vide processes or smoking or drying or even acidified foods or juice specifically in one state require a HACCP plan, and in another state they might not. So it depends on local regulations. The majority of the work I do regulations and customer requirements. I don't pretend to be an expert on every state or local jurisdiction's rules. Sometimes we need to do a little bit of research in that regard. So let's say someone said, you need a HACCP plan. We need to know what it is. In general terms, it's a detailed written program to show that you followed this established logical approach in how you identify and control risk for your food. What it does for you, besides just getting you in compliance, besides just getting permission to do what you want to do for a living, it helps you focus limited resources at targeted steps in your process to make sure that you're controlling food safety. And I emphasize that what you're doing is to ensure and usher customer safety. To ensure it means to make sure it's going to happen. You stop and think about your process and think about what may or may not add risk and make sure you control that risk. And to usher customer safety is to reassure your customers or the regulatory agencies that you're doing the right thing. So ultimately, what a HACCP plan does is prove that you took the time to think about food safety in a logical manner, make sure you're doing it right, get it on paper so that you can prove to others that you're doing it right. And it just promotes not just food safety and healthy consumers, but it makes business function. So a HACCP plan is part of something larger. It's part of a whole food safety system. And obviously there's no quiz at the end of this presentation, but this gives you the fundamentals of some pieces of a food safety system that might or should be in place, depending on what you do for a living. You start with management commitment to show that everyone cares about doing the right thing. You add to that sanitation programs or procedures or good manufacturing practices to make sure things are just basically following the fundamentals of food safety. You make sure you're carefully cleaning food contact surfaces, which is what standard sanitation procedures are about. And all of this is summarized within a HACCP plan. I was always amazed how many times when I would audit, I used to be an auditor for a living, and I much prefer training and consulting. It's a lot more fun because people aren't afraid of you. When I was an auditor, I would ask a company to show me their HACCP plan, and they would come show me this great big binder that would go thump when they put it on the table. And they'd be so proud of that binder. And I'd just kind of shake my head and say, that's not what I asked for. A HACCP plan is a summary of many of those other systems that you do. And the better you understand that and format that, the clearer your conversations will be with customers, auditors, regulators, and the like. So what do we need to do to put a HACCP plan together? And this is a very quick overview. First thing, put together a team, a HACCP team. And you can see in italics, it says multidisciplinary. You want to make sure your HACCP team includes people who understand food safety, but people who understand the process too. And sometimes you might want to include a salesperson so they don't make promises you can't deliver. But for a small company, sometimes the processing person, the food safety person, and the salesperson are all the same person. So you might need to reach out and get help, and that's okay. There's no rules that says the plan has to be created 100% in-house. Once you put together this team, you need to describe your product, its distribution, and its use. In order to understand food safety, you have to know what you're working with, right? What are your ingredients? And what are your ingredients made of? If you buy something complex like a spice mix, then you need to know what the individual components of that mix might be. So you take the time to understand your own ingredients and then describe what are you selling. And that description usually is on a form that looks exactly like this. It doesn't have to look like this, but very often it does. But that description should focus on food safety. Don't say you've got the best tasting whatever, or the greatest color whatever. That's not what this is asking about. It's asking about food safety and the attributes of your process that contribute to food safety. So things like, are there preservatives in the product? Are there allergens in the product? What kind of packaging are you using? Because that impacts what bacteria might grow or not grow. What's the intended use of your product? Is it ready to eat? Does it have to be cooked? Is it retail, wholesale, food service? Those all make a difference. And as far as distribution goes, does it have to be transported under temperature control? And will it ever be exported, or would you be aware of the fact that it's being exported? Because that can change decisions pertaining to food safety. By the way, if I show you a form and you would like a copy of that form, contact me and I will just get it to you. Okay, so once you describe your product and its use, then you would develop a flow diagram. Each step in your process where the food product changes, or each step in the process where a significant piece of equipment is involved, is represented on a diagram. And that diagram has to include everything you sell, and it includes all the steps from receiving through the magic that you do in the kitchen to packaging and to distribution. It should include on that flow chart or flow diagram all outputs, including things like waste. If there's significant waste, assurances should be made that you know how to handle or manage that. So this is just an example, a sketch of what a flow diagram might look like. And this is one for a company that's making roasted vegetables. And you can see they receive various things, they store them, they use water to wash or scrub their vegetables. You can just see the whole process there as an example. Your flow chart will be unique to your own process, but it should be accurate. If it is overly complicated, you want to step back and try and simplify it. It does not have to include inspection steps and things that you might do for quality purposes only, but it covers the basic process of how do you make the food that you want to sell. And then once you make that flow chart, especially if you make it in an office, you have to go out and verify that flow chart. When I worked in industry, I worked for a meat and poultry processor in Oklahoma for about 10 years. That's how my food career got started. And I started in the plant, and then I worked in the lab, and eventually I had this corporate type job. And they used to call the corporate people carpet people, because we had carpeting in our office. And of course, there's no carpeting in the food processing areas. So they would say carpet people don't really know what they're doing. And I bring that up to illustrate how important it is to get out into the production area or the kitchen or wherever you're actually making food. If you make a flow diagram in a room that has carpeting, it may be wrong. In fact, there's a good chance it's wrong, and you need to go out in the plant to take a look at it to make sure it's right. Walk the process with the flow chart. Make sure you look at what happens in the daytime and on second shift, if you have a second shift, and make sure that flow chart is current before you even start to write a HACCP plan. The entire plan hinges on having these things in place first. You have to understand, what's my food made of? What's the finished product like? And what's the consumer going to do with it? Because that really impacts food safety. And then you look at your own process. These are all called the preliminary steps of HACCP. They're not all mandatory by regulation, but they do define the HACCP process. The first official step in writing a HACCP plan is to conduct a hazard analysis. And this is probably the hardest part of the job. It's not something you get done in 2 hours. You might do a good job in a week or two with help. And once you get it done, it changes over time. It's a living document. So to conduct a hazard analysis, you look at everything you buy and each step in the process. That's why you make a flow chart. And you look at the hazards and what could possibly go wrong. And so these are the 3 categories of hazards that every HACCP plan needs to address. In certain circumstances, plans have to address more. If you're curious, the more is radiological hazards and economic fraud, but that's a conversation for another day. Today, we're looking at the basics. We look at biological hazards like pathogens like Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria, and those things that typically can, cause illness for the consumer. We look at chemical hazards, which can be anything from the sanitation chemicals you use to the grease that your maintenance department or maintenance person uses, to allergens, which are the most common chemical hazard. And then we look at physical hazards and things that could get into the food. Most typically, we address wood, metal, and glass, but depending on your process, you might have to address other things that could become foreign objects. The goal of the hazard analysis is to sit down and look at every input, all your ingredients, and every step, and think about all the hazards, which is a lot on your mind and is somewhat overwhelming when you look at it, but narrow it down to, of all these hazards that we're aware of, which ones are really relevant to me and my process and my ingredients. So here's where you take a million concerns of a business owner in the food industry and narrow them down and document that you did so through a logical process of reasonably likely to occur. How do you do that? There's a lot of different ways to do that. And of course, this will be recorded if you want copies of the slides. This is one way. You can look at a risk matrix where you sit down and decide, okay, I'm thinking about a specific hazard, let's say a stone in an agricultural product. And what would be the consequences if it got to the customer? Would it be a complaint? Would it be a recall? I don't think it's going to cause a fatality. That's the seriousness. And then you ask yourself, well, how likely is it to occur? And answer that question. That helps you or your team decide how serious something is. And for the most serious hazards, they're relevant, they're reasonably likely to occur, they truly need to be controlled. Well, then you'll have to look at your process and ask yourself, where do I control this? And that point is what we would call a critical control point. So this is a typical form we use. And again, if you need these forms, email me, where you look at each step and you consider biological, chemical, and physical hazards. I had one person in a HACCP class one time, I asked him, what do you think the B, the C, and the P stand for? And I was hoping for biological, chemical, and physical, but a smart aleck in class said beef, chicken, and pork. No. Okay. So you list the hazards that you thought about. You answer, is this hazard reasonably likely to occur? Is it relevant to me and my process? You explain how you know that. And then you ask yourself, what am I going to do about it? Right? If you can explain that a hazard is not relevant or likely for you, great, do so. Get that on paper. Prove that you thought about it. If it is a likely hazard, just explain what you're going to do. And then you're looking at this list of all the things you do, which is probably a long list. You do so many things for food safety. The purpose of HACCP, in my opinion, and the reason I've been teaching HACCP for so many years is because I believe in it. Its purpose is to help you focus. Of the many, many things you do to control hazards, the next step is to decide, okay, these are the things I do. Which steps are critical? They're not all critical. You know, you do 54 things a day to try and keep your label accurate and your allergens under control. But maybe the one essential thing, that one step that truly controls the hazard for the consumer, is putting the right label on the right product. And that's a step in your process, and it might be labeled a critical control point.
Hey, Cathy, we had a question, and I think this might be a good time to discuss it. Lucas asked, should or can you access the hazard plans conducted by the companies whose products you're sourcing for your own production?
You mean your ingredients? I'm guessing you're asking about your suppliers and should you look at their HACCP plans? And typically the answer to that is yes, if they will share them with you. So part of the process of building this plan is understanding, am I purchasing things with hazards? And if I am I going to control the hazard? Or am I expecting my supplier to take care of it? The most common example with that would be, let's say you're buying a spice, and that spice goes onto a product after it's been cooked. You're not going to cook the spice. You better know from your supplier that that spice is safe to eat from the beginning. On the other hand, if you're buying spices and they're going into soup and you're going to boil that soup, that's a different story. So whether or not you dig into your supplier's HACCP plans and ask for that information depends on you knowing the intended use and what you're going to do with that product.
Okay, great. Lucas had a follow-up.
Okay.
Do you assume liability of the product once you take it on?
Yes. If you are processing food, you are responsible to make sure that you do so safely. It is your obligation, even if you are a co-manufacturer, even if your customer tells you which ingredients to use, you're still making decisions as a business owner whether or not to do that. And you're obligated to do it safely. That's a
Great.
good question.
Yeah. Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah, so part of putting this plan together helps you identify, what do you really need to worry about? Is it likely to occur? Is it my responsibility? And if it is, how do I prove it's under control? And that's what critical control points are about. And again, this is a lot in just a few minutes with an overview of HACCP, but one way you can decide what's critical is by using a decision tree. Previously, you thought about all hazards and do they apply to you? And what are you doing? Then you look at all the things you're doing and decide if any of those activities are critical. And that's what this decision tree helps with. There's different ways to make that decision. This is just one example, but you might think, where do I control this process? Any step that truly on its own controls a likely hazard is a critical control point. But if you've got multiple things that contribute to food safety, they're usually not all critical. The most common mistake we see when people write a HACCP plan is they label everything as critical, and then you're overwhelmed. It takes some practice. It takes some understanding how to put together a plan properly to truly identify critical control points in a process. We go over this in a class. It's a 2-day class, and it's a bit much to go over it now, but this is just an overview of what you need to do to develop a HACCP plan. Describe your product. Make sure you know where it's, what could go wrong. Think about where it could be controlled. And of all those steps in your process where there is some level of control, you have to decide which steps are truly critical. Typically, this is cooking, cooling, and metal detection, but that's not a rule. Every company has to decide on their own based on their process what's critical. If there is a step in your process that is critical, and I emphasize the word if, because not all food processes have a critical control point. It depends on what you do for a living. But if you have a step that's critical, you have to define that step and give it limits. For example, if cooking is critical, then I'll say, okay, every hamburger has to be at least 165 degrees. Or if pH of my product is critical, then the final sauce has to have a pH less than 4.2 every time, or I will not move forward. Critical limits do not change. They are set. You do not sell the product unless you meet that limit. It defines the difference between safe and unsafe and helps prove from a scientific level that you're doing the right thing. Once you've identified those limits, you get a little gopher or whatever this picture is on this slide and ask him to keep an eye on things. Kidding. You monitor those spots. And it's very logical. That's why I promote and teach HACCP, right? We're thinking about 100 things that go wrong, narrow it down to what's critical, define that, and then keep an eye on it. And how you do that is going to be, taking temperatures, taking pH, doing other measurements at a frequency that you decide to make sure the process is under control. Once you start doing that, if life was perfect, you're good to go, but chances are something's going to go wrong. So you have to have procedures for corrective actions. And it's very explicit in the HACCP process that those procedures have multiple components. For example, when something goes wrong at a critical control point, you have to, number one, get control of the product. You might have made something unsafe. Then you have to regain control of the process because something was wrong. Then you have to figure out why this happened and prevent it from happening again. And that's hard, but there are ways to approach that so that you can do it from a logical standpoint to protect the consumer and keep your business moving forward. So that's corrective action. Verification comes after that as we're following these established principles of HACCP. And verification is proof that you followed your plan and proof that the plan worked. So you do things like review records, ensure the equipment you use was calibrated, maybe go out and watch employees do the job to make sure they did it right. Those are aspects of proving you followed the plan. Proving the plan worked can be a little bit more difficult. Sometimes there are expectations of testing, although that's not a regulatory requirement. But you may want to test your product to prove that it truly is safe, or you might just want to summarize records over time to prove that your process is stable and that you're not getting customer complaints and that your system is working. And then finally, as we go through these 7 principles of HACCP, the last one is record keeping. There needs to be a system in place to assure that you're going to keep records as long as you should by law or by customer requirement, depending on your circumstance. In general, if you make an FDA regulated product, you have to keep records for at least 2 years. If you make a USDA regulated product, it depends on what you make and whether or not it's fresh or frozen, and their record retention times are shorter. So that's a very, very quick overview of what we're talking about with HACCP. This form shows how you would summarize these critical control points. So let's say you make some fully cooked product and cooking is critical. So you would say the critical control point is your cooking step. You would name the hazard. Maybe you're worried about salmonella because you use raw eggs in your process and you have to cook whatever your finished product might be. The critical limits will be very specific. Each batch will reach X temperature, something like that. Then you would have monitoring procedures that are summarized here as to who's doing the monitoring, how often, exactly how do they do it. You'll have a corrective action plan that always will address what do you do with the product? How do you return control if the situation is not under control? How do you figure out what happened when something goes wrong and what you will do about it? You'll have verification procedures that include record review, usually calibration and maybe some direct observation of your employees, and you'll name the records that you create. This particular form is extremely common in a HACCP plan. You don't need this form unless you have a critical control point, but in some cases they will call that a process preventive control. I know it's a lot of acronyms, but it's the food industry and it's what we do. We make things tasty and we invent acronyms. So this is a HACCP plan and the essential things that you're going to control by having that plan. There is another term I wanted to bring up in this really fast overview, and that is a food safety plan. If someone says you need a food safety plan, that might mean something different than saying you need a HACCP plan. A HACCP plan follows the process that I just ran through rather quickly. And it really focuses on the process, step by step. What do you do and what are the hazards? A food safety plan is often viewed as something a little bit bigger. It's mandated for products that are regulated by the FDA, but not all products. There are exceptions and modifications because the legal world is complicated, as we all know. But in general, if you have to have a food safety plan, you still do this hazard analysis. You still have a team. You still make a flow chart and describe your product. But then from your hazard analysis, you'll see they use different terms here. And instead of something called a critical control point, they might call it a process preventive control. And then under this particular regulation, which comes from the Food Safety Modernization Act, there's a lot of emphasis on sanitation, allergen, and supply chain controls. And you can see those symbols for those programs are partway inside of a food safety plan, inside of that yellowish sort of filled in area, and part of it outside of a food safety plan. So it gets complicated. Essentially, HACCP helps you narrow down within your process, what are the critical things I have to do for safety? Within a food safety plan, sometimes there are programs that you have to look at with almost the same thought process. For example, you have an entire sanitation program that includes how to clean the desktop in the front office, but you narrow down that sanitation program to what aspect of it might truly be essential from a food safety standpoint for my consumer. And sometimes those things become part of what is called a food safety plan. Understanding food safety plans comes from a different class. It's not a HACCP class, it's a preventive controls class. Generally, you don't have to take that class until your business has grown beyond being a very small business into one that is of a certain gross sales per year and definitely in interstate commerce. Okay, so it's a little bit complicated, but I wanted you to be aware, if you hear the term food safety plan, what they really mean is a HACCP plan that has some more information that was added to it because of FDA regulations. Okay, so how do you get started? First, I do recommend training. It's not mandatory in all cases. Under USDA or FSIS, the regulation does say a trained person has to develop the plan. I consider training essential, not just because it's what I do for a living, but because it helps people save money in the end. If you know how to do it yourself, you have control. You can make sure it's right. You don't have to spend a lot of money on outside help. But there is help through agencies, which is why we're putting on this webinar today. So consider getting training and then define your product and process. As we talked about, know your ingredients, know your finished product, and create that flow diagram. It takes a few tries usually to get it right. Then you would evaluate the hazards and write down how you're controlling them today. And if you identify a hazard that you're not controlling, maybe you should start controlling it, or prove that it's not reasonably likely for your process. And you put all those things together. Did I define my process? Did I define the hazards? Am I controlling them? If you can prove that you're doing those things, then you're well on your way to having a HACCP plan. How do you get the details that you need? You know, how are you supposed to know what the hazards are? How are you supposed to know what to do about them? Both USDA and FDA have extensive guidance material. It can be found online. If you need help finding that, let me know. You can also use the food code. If you've looked at that, I always like to remind people the food code is not a law. The food code is written by the FDA as a recommendation for all of the states in the United States. And each state decides which aspects of the food code it wants to adopt as part of their state law. Okay, so that's the legal background behind that. The reason I bring it up, though, is the food code is an excellent reference. How do I know what temperature I should cook something? You can probably find it in the food code. So, I wanted to keep this short so we have time to just chat, right? But there are a lot of rules here. HACCP as to approaching food safety. It's internationally accepted. It is just in the food industry, this is how we do things to not only make food safe, but to prove to other people that you did so. We all have the same goal. FDA, USDA customers, sometimes the way they want you to document things might be different. Sometimes we might, I should say we will, disagree as to what's critical and what's not. In the end, the goal is to make safe food, prove that you make safe food, right? And encourage commerce so that we can make this happen and make people happy with the foods that we produce. So if you have questions, I'll just kind of stop screen sharing and we can chat a little bit. It looks like there's some questions in the chat function.
Yeah, we've got a couple. The first one from Natasha, where can I get FSP or juice HACCP training? I'm going to step in first and say that we're planning on putting some of that type stuff together. I don't know if that's very specific to something else, but so definitely I'll be sending out an email with the recording on it and some of the other information. If you're interested in training, please respond to that email and say, hey, whenever you guys get together, we'd love to be in touch with you. Now, Cathy, you can speak to specific FSP and juice training if that's something a little different than what we had planned.
No, juice HACCP is specific. It's a regulatory requirement. You can take a HACCP class that would satisfy for juice, or you can find a class that is specific to juice. Most of the HACCP training we offer is open to multiple food groups, and that way we get interesting conversations throughout the class. When you say FSP, you're referring to a food safety plan. That's different from juice HACCP. And that would be called a preventive controls class. You usually start with HACCP and then do preventive controls later because it's a little bit more complicated.
Okay, great. We've also got how do I ensure my HACCP plan aligns with international standards?
As any good consultant, I'm going to say that depends. When you say standards, it depends on what standards you're referring to. A lot of times we're talking about third-party audits, and they are sometimes globally aligned. An example would be called an SQF, or Safe Quality Food Audit. That's internationally acceptable. All of those audits follow the HACCP principle as defined by Codex. If you need a copy of the Codex document that defines HACCP, I can send that to you. We also talk about that a lot in a HACCP class.
Okay, and the follow-up question on that was, will it take a year to establish a HACCP plan? So yeah, how long is it going to take?
Oh gosh, I hope not. Year is a very long time. No, it shouldn't take a year. Typically, depending on the stability of your process, how much you understand about your process, you can put a HACCP plan together in a month. The ideal is to take 3 months of data after you've started running under that plan and summarize that data, and that's proof that your plan works. And moving forward, you use that as validation data, saying, here, I put my plan together. I have 90 days to show you that it is effective, and then you go forward from there.
Okay, great, great. And I had one. I see Russ Bailey on here. So Russ, forgive me for paraphrasing from something that I heard you say in a meeting once, but he spoke about how smaller food producers can be impacted a great deal if someone, nobody wants to get anybody sick, but if that happens, it can have a bigger impact. So what would you say to somebody who's on here who says, oh, I'm just a small person, I don't need to worry about all of this stuff? What would be your advice to them?
I talk about this in training too. The importance of documentation to prove that what you're doing is right. I realize paper doesn't make food safer, but paper makes business happen, right? Whether it's paper money or paper contracts, paper helps us trust each other, and that's part of the reason for a HACCP plan. But if you think about, I call it the American way, in terms of guilt or innocence, right? You're talking about a problem, a consumer got sick. The American way is you're innocent unless proven guilty. And that's one of the beauties of how our country is created and how it should be run. In the food industry, sorry to say, it's pretty much the opposite. Your food is not safe unless you can prove it is. That's why this becomes so important. If you can't show that you thought about something ahead of time, then you didn't. And if someone is hurt or injured or ill because of your food, you can see that that's not going to go over very well, even if you are a small business. If you're a small business, I recommend you put a HACCP plan together, just a very simple one, and improve it over time.
Great, great, thank you. I don't see any other questions coming up. And this has been here we go. To follow up on that question, are there times you have to adjust HACCP plans?
All the time. If you change your process, you buy a new piece of equipment, you adjust your flow chart. If you buy a new ingredient, you adjust the information that might pertain to that ingredient. If you change a recipe or you have a new allergen, you would adjust your plan. Typically, if you have a stable process and nothing changes, you should recheck your plan once a year. Most customers or third-party audits expect that. Just at least once a year, make sure your plan still makes sense. From a regulatory standpoint, you must do that if you have an FSIS product, meat, poultry, egg products, or catfish. From an FDA perspective, you have to do that every 3 years. So at a minimum once a year, but for years that you relook at your plan. Another reason that you have to keep these plans alive is that you should look at what's going on in industry. Don't do your work in a silo. When we started seeing news of cinnamon being a problem, I don't know if people are aware of cinnamon having been a problem in the United States, but there was some economic fraud and we found lead in cinnamon. Every manufacturer or large scale manufacturer that handled cinnamon took another look at their HACCP plan because now there was a hazard they hadn't thought about before. Or the first time that we started seeing E. coli associated with spinach, and we never did in the past, everyone updated their HACCP plans to say, hey, there's a new hazard out there, we need to address it. So as food safety evolves, as consumer habits change, even as your distribution changes, you relook at your plan. If you started out small and you know where your product's going, great. And then you start selling to a distributor, and then that distributor starts selling to daycare or schools. You should rethink your plan and just make sure you're still on top of controlling what needs to be controlled. I don't mean to make it sound scary, but it's a living thing and you have to take care of it as a living document and a living process.
Great, great. Well, I think we're done with questions. Great information, Cathy. Thank you so much. That was exactly what I think everybody wanted. Everybody can expect an email coming from me with some information, and like I said, please respond to that if you're interested in future training. I think we're going to try to get some stuff together and work with Cathy some more on that to get some of these plans in place. This has been a really hard webinar for me because I've been sitting here the whole time thinking, I want some Hall's chocolates, or I want some custard stand chili, maybe some Oliverios peppers. So fortunately, we've made it to lunchtime, so we can go dig into what we have in our cabinets that a lot of the people who are here are doing. So thank you, everyone. And oh, someone else is asking for the slides. Cathy, is that okay if we send those out as well?
Yes, of course.
Sure. Okay. We'll get those with a recording link. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And the WVU Industrial Extension definitely considers food producers, manufacturers. So never hesitate to reach out to us if there's anything we can help you to do to thrive and grow. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.